Southampton Docks, Britain's premier passenger port. In the year 1938, her visitors totaled over 5.5 millions, and her gross tonnage nearly 20 millions. The outbreak of war in 1939 meant that Southampton's normal traffic was to diminish daily, while her wartime traffic increased as our factories turned plowshares into tanks and guns. Southampton became a frontline port overnight. Not a new role, she'd played it so well in the last war. Supplies for the BEF began to arrive at Southampton for shipment in vast quantities. The docks and the ships were fully prepared to cope with these urgent dispatches. In addition to the supplies already being dealt with, the men themselves arrived on foot, in trucks and in trains, to be sent across the channel. The increasing tempo of life at the docks did not impair the proverbial smooth operation for which Southampton is rightly celebrated. These were days of intensive activity. The docks' quays were crowded with troops and supplies, and the Southern Railway staff worked ceaselessly in cooperation with the military to perform titanic feats of shipping in preparation for the first big offensive across the Channel. Well-known liners anchored in Southampton's waters steamed away to become transports for Dominion troops. Many Southern Railway ships, long familiar to holidaymakers, went on active service. Among them was the Sandown, which had operated on the Isle of Wight services for years. She had been refitted and equipped for her new and dangerous job, minesweeping. Southampton began to receive a large number of mine-damaged vessels. Between 1939 and VE Day, nearly 800 were reconditioned in the company's marine workshops. The disastrous fall of France brought the BEF crowding to the continental beaches, from which they were rescued by fleets of the now famous little ships. Southampton, with other British ports, welcomed a whole host of these vessels and offered them a temporary refuge at her hospitable quay sides. French troops, as well as our own, arrived hourly from across the Channel during a period of 2 weeks or more. All of them had to be fed, accommodated, and equipped for the next round of the fight. At this time, too, the evacuation of the Channel Islands took place, and an unhappy band of refugees arrived to take shelter in the mother country. Southampton had arranged to take care of their immediate needs and to dispatch them quickly to more peaceful havens for the duration. During 1941 and 42, the early raids on Southampton caused considerable havoc. The dock's ARP control post was destroyed, and other damage proved very extensive. major casualties of the bombing of the docks were a flour mill and the great cold storage depot there. Raging fires consumed a month's rations for the whole of southern England. The heat of the blazing fats and foodstuffs was so intense that most of the water from the firemen's hoses turned to steam before it reached the flames. When the conflagration at last subsided, the ruined shells of offices, warehouses and sheds remained everywhere. Colonel Moore Brabazon, then Minister of Transport, came to Southampton to inspect the dock's ARP squads and to congratulate them on their fine performance in action. In 1942, America began to ship to Britain considerable quantities of goods to meet both our war and domestic needs. These shipments increased almost daily, and in a short while, Lease Lend was in full operation. Southampton's dockside cranes now had a full-time job. Between the two wars, the Southern Railway had constructed a huge extension to the docks, embodying 7,000 feet of deep-water quays and the largest graving dock in the world, the King George V, as well as up-to-the-minute sheds and equipment. All these facilities proved of the greatest use in handling the lease lend traffic. Lease lend was eventually followed by the entry of the United States into world hostilities, and Britain soon became populated with thousands of Yanks who brought with them all the might and power of America's factories in the shape of countless engines of war in enormous quantities. They established a major port headquarters at Southampton docks, and the closest possible cooperation existed between them, the British military authorities, and the Southern Railway personnel. Southampton's quays and sheds had been designed to cope with huge export and import traffic, but the congestion at this time was such that the vast priority shipments overflowed into the King George V graving dock, where the heavy cranes provided handled tanks and guns with ease. American military police worked with the Southern Railway force to guard the secrets of Southampton's dock area from prying eyes. To replace the ARP center, destroyed previously by bombs, a new docks control was built with walls of steel and concrete 14 feet thick. In addition to the work of the dockyard, the Southern Railway, in its own workshops at Eastleigh, constructed many strange craft to government orders. These were transported to Southampton and later used in the D-Day offensive. During 1943 and 44, the King George V graving dock and others of Southampton's dry docks cradled the undertaking known afterwards to the world as the Mulberry Port Scheme. Briefly, the idea was to prefabricate a harbour formed of huge pierheads anchored to the seabed by mooring columns and linked to the land by floating moles on which our troops and their supplies could be landed when the invasion of France did take place. To overcome the danger of heavy seas, floating concrete breakwaters were built to protect the moles. All this work had to be kept top secret. These Cleopatra's Needles were the anchoring columns on which the pontoons rode up and down with the ebb and flow of the tide. In the foreground here is one of the moles on which the troops and supplies were landed. And here is a finished pierhead ready for towing across the channel. These are the concrete caissons which formed the floating breakwater, a most important feature of the Mulberry Port undertaking. As it later proved, they were largely responsible for the success of the scheme, as the weather during the invasion period turned unexpectedly rough. An army of skilled and unskilled workmen were recruited to speed the job along to its completion in a seemingly impossibly short time, during which interference from enemy planes was surprisingly negligible. Partly finished caissons were floated out of the dry dock and towed to neighboring wet berths as soon as work on them had progressed sufficiently. Work recommenced in the dry docks at once. The Invicta, a Southern Railway supership, completed after the outbreak of war, had never fulfilled her intended peacetime function of conveying Golden Arrow passengers between England and the continent. In her wartime garb, she transported troops and their landing barges to the French coast. The Invicta carried 6 of these landing craft, slung alongside on davits of special design. Here are 2 more Southern Railway vessels, the Isle of Jersey and the Dinard, enrolled for war service with the Red Cross. A whole sisterhood of other ships of the company's fleet had done great war work in their various capacities. The Isle of Guernsey, the Biarritz, Maid of Orleans and the Canterbury, well remembered by Southern Railway cross-channel passengers in former years, are shown here awaiting their sailing orders. With the 2 exceptions of the Dinard and the Maid of Orleans, they survived their subsequent D-Day adventures without serious harm. A sidelight on dockside activities during the intensive preparations for D-Day is furnished by the Providore Department, whose heavy but happy responsibility was the revictualling of its allotted fleet of ships among the host of craft gathered in Southampton's waters. As the invasion 0 hour approached, the 7 miles of Southampton's dockyard quays presented an unforgettable sight. So many invasion craft were gathered there, they had to be berthed abreast. 18 of the Southern Railway's own fleet of vessels were taking part, and these pictures prove what an inestimable blessing the new docks extensions were to Britain in this war, throughout which Southampton docks continue to be owned, operated and managed by the company. D-Day came at last, and immediately afterwards, in the space of just 17 weeks, the traffic handled at Southampton exceeded in tonnage figures the trade of the whole of the last pre-war year. Between D-Day and VJ Day, some 14 months, 30.5 million gross tons of shipping entered the docks, and this excludes the small craft. 2.5 million tons of freight were handled over the quays, and 3.5 million servicemen passed through the port. Some 21,000 railway wagons and 770 locomotives were shipped. Men, vehicles and equipment continued to pour in for shipment. The tide of outward traffic was continually rising, and the work of loading and dispatching went on day and night. Southampton Docks, as the 14th major port of the United States Army, eclipsed all its own former records and earned a glorious reputation at this period. The Americans had one main idea: to carry the war to the heart of Germany till it was all over there. An interesting little ceremony marked the embarkation of the millionth Yank for the continent. It was attended by the Southern Railway Docks and Marine Manager, the Mayor of Southampton, and the American military officials. Many ships had now returned to Southampton, damaged in the Great Invasion Crusade. The dry docks were used continuously for the overhaul and repair of these vessels. The Dinard, one of the Southern Railway ships in the Red Cross service, struck a mine and limped home to Southampton half full of water. Continual pumping kept the Dinard afloat until she could receive proper attention. When she was dry docked, her extensive damage was revealed. The large hole in her hull and her internal injuries necessitated a long and enforced retirement from war service. Southampton Docks workshops now had another honorable casualty in their expert care. Other hospital ships were still carrying on with their good work. Arrangements for the reception of the invasion casualties at Southampton were absolutely complete. Ambulances and stretcher trolleys were swarming on the quays. Some cases were carried from the ships to the waiting trolleys. Colored American orderlies, patient and cat-like in their tread, performed a grand job in handling these casualties. Other cases were slung direct from the ships to the trolleys and wheeled away to trains waiting to carry them to hospitals standing by for this emergency rush. German prisoners began to arrive in considerable numbers. By now they realized their game was up. The liberation of Cherbourg led to the early establishment of a train ferry service between Southampton and the French port for the quick conveyance of freight and rolling stock to the continent. 2 train ferry terminals were constructed at Southampton, and the company's own train ferry vessels and crews were employed in this service, remaining under Southern Railway control, as was the case of all the Southern ships throughout the war. One important feature of the shipping of this traffic was the special link span, which worked like a drawbridge between ship and shore. By its use, whole trains of goods wagons, Red Cross coaches and other rolling stock were enabled to run straight onto the ferry boats. The principle of the peacetime Dover to Dunkirk train ferry had been very successfully adapted to Southampton's wartime needs. Thus were the railroads of France replenished with the rolling stock necessary to carry the Allied armies to final victory. And later, to mark that victory, a plaque was unveiled at the dock gates. 1939 to 1945. This tablet was presented to the Southern Railway by the 14th Major Port, United States Army, in proud and glorious memory of the men and women of the forces of the United Nations who sailed from this port during the Great War Against Aggression to secure the freedom of mankind. The war over, Southampton Docks is fast returning to normal activity. She might take a well-earned rest, but that is not in the dock's tradition. Far from it. Famous ships, back to their peacetime work, once more throng her quaysides. Southampton Docks, owned and managed by the Southern Railway, is still Britain's premier passenger port, prepared to receive any ship and every ship.